Joe Marcus. An economist, he had worked in the New Deal days on a Harry Hopkins project, a study of the effect of technology on re-employment opportunities. In other words, why the stickiness of unemployment? In 39, you still had over 10 million unemployed out of a labor supply of 40 million. You're talking about 25% of the population. In 36, there were 15 million unemployed, if not more. Industrial production came back to the 29 level around 37, just for a few months. Then it slid off into the Depression again. The New Deal starts wondering about problems. Maybe it's monopoly, maybe it's technology. That's the work I got involved in. I think it was 31 or 32. I was attending the City College in New York. Most were students whose parents were small businessmen or workers hit by the Great Depression. In the public speaking class, I was called upon to talk about unemployment insurance. I was attacked by most of the students. This was socialism. I was shocked by their vehemence. If I remember, the American Federation of Labor at its national convention voted it down. The idea of Social Security was very advanced. Those who were really hungry wanted something. But the intellectuals, the students, the bureaucratic elements, to them, it was a horrible thought. It was something subversive. At first. But they learned quickly. It was a shock to them. When Roosevelt came out with the ideas, it was not a clearly well thought out program. There was much improvisation. What you had was a deep-seated emotional feeling, as far as the people were concerned, a willingness to change society, just out of outrage, out of need. I think they would have accepted even more radical ideas. Roosevelt was reflecting the temper of the time, the emotional more than the intellectual. It wasn't merely a question of the king bestowing favors. The pressure from below was a reality. It was not a concentrated campaign effort. There was no organization with a program that commanded the majority of the people. This was part of the political strangeness of our society. The actions below were very revolutionary. Yet, some of the ideas of the people, generally, were very backward. I graduated college in 35. I went down to Washington and started to work in the spring of 36. The New Deal was a young man's world. Young people, if they showed any ability, got an opportunity. I was a kid, 22 or 23. In a few months, I was made head of the department. We had a meeting with hotshots. What's to be done? I pointed out some problems. Let's define what we're looking for. They immediately had me take over. I had to set up the organization and hire 75 people. Given a chance as a youngster to try out ideas, I learned a fantastic amount. The challenge itself was great. It was the idea of being asked big questions. The technical problems were small. These you had to solve by yourself. But the context was broad. Where was society going? Your statistical questions became questions of full employment. You were not prepared for it in school. If you wanted new answers, you needed a new kind of people. This is what was exciting. Ordinarily, I might have had a job at a university, marking papers or helping a professor. All of a sudden, I'm doing original research and asking basic questions about how society works. What makes a depression? What makes for pulling out of it? Once you start thinking in these terms, you're in a different ballgame. The climate was exciting. You were part of a society that was on the move. You were involved in something that could make a difference. Laws could be changed, and so could the conditions of people. The idea of being involved close to the center of political life was unthinkable just 2 or 3 years before all this happened. Unthinkable for someone like me, of lower middle class, close to ghetto Jewish life. Suddenly you were a significant member of society. It was not the kind of closed society you had lived in before. You weren't in the situation kids are in today, where you're confronted with a consensus of hopelessness, unless you just break things up. You were really part of something. Changes could be made, bringing immediate results to people who were starving. You could do something about it. That was the most important thing. This you felt. A feeling that if you had something to say, it would get to the top. As I look back now, memoranda I had written reached the White House one way or another. The biggest thrill of my life was hearing a speech of Roosevelt's, using a selection from a memorandum I had written. Everybody was searching for ideas. A lot of guys were opportunists, some were crackpots, but there was a search, a sense of values, that would make a difference in the lives of people. We weren't thinking of remaking society, that wasn't it. I didn't buy this dream stuff. What was happening was a complete change in social attitudes at the central government level. The question was, how can you do it within this system? People working in all the New Deal agencies were dominated by this spirit. There was the old government bureaucracy that could not administer the new programs. Roosevelt, who was criticized for being a bad administrator, made a great deal of sense out of this. There were weaknesses, but the point is, if you wanted to get jobs for people in a hurry, as in WPA, you had to find new people with the spirit, with the drive. At one stage, Harry Hopkins met with his staff, a lot of people, in a huge auditorium. He explained they'd have to work day and night to get this particular job done. He asked for volunteers, who would start off tonight and work straight through. Practically everybody in the auditorium raised their hands. Youth and fervor. Normally, administrative people were much older, but even the young of the old bureaucracy were stodgy. They came to work, left their jobs when the day was over, went out for their lunches. Frankly, they didn't work very hard and knocked off whenever they could. What right-wingers say about government employees was very true in many cases. The New Dealers were different. I'm not only talking about policy people, I'm talking about the clerks who felt what they were doing was important. You didn't take time out for lunch because of a job that had to be done. You had a sandwich on the desk. Their job made sense. Of course, I'm romanticizing somewhat, but there was still this difference. The civil servants were competent people, but they worked within rigid formulas. They worked their hours, and when they were through, that was it. The idea of sitting up all night? The evenings were exciting. Social evenings were spent in discussing policy, in what you were doing. It wasn't bridge playing, it wasn't just idle drinking or gossip. His wife, Sue, interjects. The wives took a very dim view of men getting off in a corner talking about the levels of unemployment. The women were clustered together on the other side, but the husbands were so busy, so involved. We took a dim view, I must say. Every once in a while we'd say, "What is it?" We'd be interested. But it was very hard because they were so terribly involved. He laughs, then adds, "It would get very technical, I must admit. Shop talk." Sue. We were interested in what our husbands were doing. We felt as they did, that it was terribly important. Although I remember once when Joe's boss called about something, they wanted me to look for a piece of paper on the desk. He said, "I hope you don't mind my taking your husband weekends like that." She said, "I certainly do." When Joe came home, he said, "Oh, that was a terrible thing you said. After all, it's for the war effort." This was in the late 30s. We understood the philosophical things. That was taken for granted. It's the technical discussions that were so annoying. Other wives, too, felt part of this effort. But on a social level, it sometimes got difficult. They got so immersed in technical questions the ceiling could have fallen in and they wouldn't have noticed. The ambitious young man today takes his work home too. But it's a question of himself. Personal ambition, not concern with society. Of course, some of our best operators were personally ambitious, but the climate was something else. There was no difference between leisure time and work time. This doesn't mean we didn't go for a movie or go for a walk in the park, but the people I knew did not build a meaningful life outside of work, and action related to it in some way. Sue. One of the nicest things in Washington, with all the other New Deal people, was that everybody lived on the same level. The notion of keeping up with the Joneses didn't exist. Nobody was pushing for anything because everybody was involved. It was an exciting community where we lived in Washington. The basic feeling, and I don't think this is just nostalgia, was one of excitement, of achievement, of happiness. Life was important. Life was significant. Were there questions in Washington about the nature of our society? I don't think revolution as a topic of the day existed. The fact that people acted as they did in violation of law and order was itself a revolutionary act. People suddenly heard there was a Communist Party. It was insignificant before then. Suddenly, the more active people, the more concerned people, were in one way or another exposed to it. It never did command any real popular support, though it had influence in key places. This was a new set of ideas, but revolution was never really on the agenda. FDR was there significant in understanding how best to lead this sort of situation. Not by himself, but he mobilized those elements ready to develop these programs. There are some who say FDR saved this society. There's no question about it. The industrialists, who had some understanding, recognized this right away. He could not have done what he did without the support of important elements of the wealthy class. They did not sabotage the programs, they did just the opposite. One of the first things the annual report of Morgan and Company dealt with, right after the war, was the question of full employment. This had been considered a Bolshevik idea 5 years earlier. Business leaders, in the early days of the war, saw the importance of developing more progressive programs. It was a way of rationalizing a corporate society. The New Deal did the same thing. It was a very unusual depression in the history of societies. It lasted so long and went so deep. Usually, when you get a depression, even a severe one, you get 2-3 years decline, and in another 2-3 years you're back where you were. But 10 years? Just think, in 1939 we were back to the industrial production of 29. And you had a 10-year increase in population. If it weren't for the war orders from France and England, there's a question if we would ever have hit that point. The war did end the Depression. That doesn't mean that something else might not have ended it.